The first time they saw her spreading apple slices on a canvas tarp pinned to her cabin roof, half the men in the valley chuckled. By the time she strung fish on twine between tree branches, they laughed out loud. "Drying food in the sun like some desert lizard," barked Earl Krause, shaking his head as he hitched his mule outside the general store. "She thinks the winter's gonna steal her soul." That summer, the widow Abatha Crane barely stepped into town. When she did, she didn't buy coffee or flour or any of the usual staples. Only salt, so much salt that the storekeeper, Jed Huckley, joked he might as well start calling his place a tannery. She didn't react, just paid in silver and walked out. Even in July, her yard looked like a battlefield after the siege. Canvas tarps stretched tight between tree limbs. Cedar racks jammed with drying meat, bushels of root vegetables split and laid open on screens. Every surface near her cabin became a drying shelf. She turned her front porch into a solar oven of sorts, glass panes leaning against metal to trap heat and smoke. Abatha Crane, alone at the far end of Ash Hollow Ridge, was building a fortress out of food. The men said she'd gone touched in the head. Women whispered that she couldn't move on from grief. Children dared each other to go spy on the witch widow and report back what she was doing with all those jars. But none of them knew what she knew. None of them had buried a husband and 2 sons in one winter. Abatha had once been the kind of woman folks leaned on. Before the snowstorm of '83 took her husband, Tom Crane, and the fever weeks later stole both her boys, 5 and 7. She used to run quilting bees, lend herbs for birthing, even mend boots for men too proud to ask. Then came the blizzard. 3 weeks sealed in with no firewood, half a sack of oats, and no meat. The baby died first. Then her husband, frostbitten lungs, too far gone. The older boy clung on another day. She'd had to wrap him in blankets and rock him until his eyes stopped blinking. After the thaw, when she could finally drag their bodies out beneath the ice-covered door, she built their graves behind the cabin and didn't leave for weeks. She never forgot what hunger sounded like inside a child. That summer, Abatha didn't speak much. She barely slept either. Most nights she'd sit by her open-sided smoke shed and stoke the embers just enough to keep the fish curing. She built a box of river stones, trapping heat through the day, then used it to dry herbs at night. Her hands, once soft from embroidery, turned calloused and cracked. She sharpened knives more than she spoke. By August, her yard smelled like leather and thyme, sweet apples and peppered meat. Bears sniffed at the edges of her clearing and turned away. So did neighbors. Lydia Farrow, a preacher's wife, said with a sour twist to her mouth, "She's got so much food drying, she must think God himself is gonna starve us." To which her husband had replied, "And yet she's the only one not asking for credit at the store." The teasing turned to real concern in September, when the rains came too early. The valley depended on the pass road, 20 miles of switchback track that led to the supply depot over the ridge. 1 week into the rains, 2 wagon loads of goods didn't make it. By week 3, the mudslide hit. Whole trees twisted down into the canyon, pulling boulders the size of oxen with them. The road, what was left of it, disappeared beneath 100 feet of shifting debris, and it kept raining non-stop. Jed Huckley nailed a notice on the post office door. "Road washed out. Last delivery unknown. Pray for supplies by snow." But even prayer won't stop winter. By mid-October, people started trading tools for food. A rifle fetched a half sack of beans. A good kettle earned a few onions. Those who'd mocked Abatha most now eyed her cabin like it was a vault. Still, she didn't come to town, and no one dared go up her trail. Tommy Bell was the first. Only 16, he'd lost his mother 2 years prior, and his father had been drunk every evening since. When they ran out of food entirely, when even the bark stew and boiled leather failed, Tommy bundled himself in an old horse blanket and trudged up the ridge in the sleet. He knocked once on Abatha's door, then collapsed. When he awoke, he was warm. Something sweet bubbled nearby. He could smell thyme. Abatha didn't speak at first, only handed him a mug of hot broth and sat on the opposite side of the stove. After a time, she said, "You here to rob me?" Tommy shook his head, shivering. "I don't have much left," he lied. "Just figured I'd die slower up here." Abatha said nothing, but she placed a biscuit on his lap and returned to stirring the pot. Tommy never left. 3 days later, he was hauling in firewood and tending smoke racks like he'd been doing it all summer. Abatha gave him chores, rules, and silence. She also gave him food. Word got out fast. One child surviving off the widow's kindness was one thing, but when Tommy's father came up with a pistol demanding she give his son back and left an hour later with nothing but a black eye and a broken finger, the town realized Abatha wasn't running a charity. She was building something else. Then came the freeze. Early November dropped like a hammer. 5 feet of snow in 2 nights. The creek iced solid. Chickens froze in their coops. 2 babies died of cold before morning. A house fire, started by a family trying to warm stones on the stove, killed a mother and her boy in their sleep. There was no more laughter now, only quiet panic, and it was then that 3 families, ones who'd mocked her most, trudged up the ridge with frostbitten fingers and hollow eyes. They didn't bring gifts, they didn't bring weapons. They brought children, and they begged. The snow didn't stop. For 13 days, not a single patch of brown earth showed. Smoke curled thinner from chimneys, and some cabins no longer smoked at all. Chickens froze to death standing upright. Wells cracked beneath ice. A young girl was found at the edge of her family's barn, barefoot, holding her dead brother's coat. No one remembered what she was doing out there. She never spoke again. In the town below Ash Hollow Ridge, hunger became a presence, a living thing, heavier than snow. It made men bite their tongues and women weep over empty pots. It made strong-backed fathers eye the weaker among them, and mothers start boiling pine bark in desperation. The pass road was still gone. The telegraph wire, snapped by falling trees, hung useless between poles. No messages came in. No wagons came down. The valley was cut off, and winter had come early, and the widow who had been laughed at was now a beacon on the hill. Abatha did not open her door for every knock. She watched through the narrow slit in her shutter, her rifle loaded, hands steady even as her heart stung to see babies wrapped in rags and fathers thin as the ribs of a starved dog. But she wasn't giving away food. That wasn't what she'd dried, salted, smoked and sealed all summer for. Not for pity, not for pride, but for survival. And survival, she knew, required choices. So she made them. She let in families, sometimes only the children, on one condition. They worked, they hauled water, they split logs, they hauled snow and kept fire paths clear. They didn't complain, didn't steal, and didn't demand. Her house, once silent as a crypt, was now humming. 10 people in a 2-room cabin. No privacy, no softness, but warmth and food. Her stores were unlike anything the others imagined. She had over 40 pounds of dried apples alone, crisp golden slivers, sealed in beeswax-wrapped pouches, jars of sun-dried tomatoes and thick-cut zucchini rounds stacked in rows, 2 shelves of smoked trout, bass, and bluegill from the creek, filleted and cured in salt, racks of venison jerky cut so thin it snapped like bark, a barrel of pickled beets, crates of carrot leather, dark orange and bitter, sprigs of herbs braided and dried like garlands, thyme, sage, lemon balm, mint. A hidden pit under the floorboards held potatoes and turnips in layers of straw and sawdust. All summer she had built her reserve in silence while others laughed. Now they whispered her name in reverence, and some in envy. It wasn't long before things grew tense in the valley. Rumors spread that she had hundreds of pounds of food, that she was hiding guns, that she was letting in some families and turning away others, that she'd poisoned a man who tried to steal from her. Most of it was false, some of it wasn't. The second man who tried to rob her, Elias Gray, a hunter who once told her she ought to remarry before she turned to ice, met a steel trap hidden near her porch and left with 2 fingers gone. He crawled back down the ridge screaming. No one else tried. Instead, the town began to crack in on itself. The worst of it came when Franklin Neely, a mill hand whose wife had died giving birth the prior year, brought his 6-year-old girl, Clara, up to Abatha's door. He didn't ask to stay. He only asked her to take the girl. "I can't feed her," he said through chattering teeth. "She hasn't eaten in 2 days. She keeps coughing. I know what it means." Abatha looked at the child, thin, pale, but her eyes still held fire. "I can help," the girl said, clutching a battered ragdoll. "I sweep good. I don't cry." Abatha didn't say yes. She opened the door, and that was enough. Neely wept into his hands, kissed his daughter's cheek, and walked back down into the white without another word. Clara worked harder than the grown men in that house. Tommy, the boy who'd arrived first, became her right hand. At 17, he was tall now, shoulders hardened by labor. He chopped more wood than anyone, knew where the traps were, helped ration food without whining. He built a sled from scrap and took 2 boys every few days to check the stream, to melt snow or fetch kindling. And it was Tommy who noticed the footprints. 2 pairs, coming up the ridge, heavy steps, staggered, not children, not families. Abatha read the tracks like scripture. "Men? Starving men?" Tommy asked. "Desperate men," she replied. "That's worse." She sent the children inside and locked the door. The first came into view just before dusk. Henry Thatcher, former cattleman turned drunkard. The second was Cyrus Boone, a known brawler who'd once been jailed for beating his sister-in-law near to death. They carried nothing, no packs, no offerings, just hunger in their eyes and cold around their hearts. Abatha didn't wait for them to reach the porch. She stepped out, rifle on her shoulder, hair tied back in a braided coil, her breath turning to steam in the frigid air. "You need to turn back," she said flatly. Boone sneered. Heard you got apples and fish up here. Heard you're feeding kids like they were royalty. They work, she said. We ain't here to work. Then you're not here to eat, Thatcher laughed, but it came out as a wheeze. You're not gonna shoot us, Abby. You're a church woman. You stitched my baby's blanket. I stitched a shroud too, she said. 3 of them. Don't think I forgot how. Her finger hovered near the trigger. Boone took 1 step closer. Tommy's voice rang out behind her. 1 more step. You'll both be buried in the snow. The men didn't stay. That night they found a bear's carcass half-eaten behind the general store, and the next day, Boone was gone. No one ever found his body. The cabin now held 14 people, children mostly, 2 mothers, one old man who'd once taught school, and now helped keep the fire stoked while he told stories of how people survived winters in the old countries, stories about root cellars and snow-melting tunnels and heating rocks in ovens, then sleeping beside them wrapped in wool. It was from him that Abatha got the idea for the chimney stone ring. They moved a ring of heavy flat rock, kept warm at the base of the stove, into the beds at night. The heat lingered. It let 3 children sleep through without coughing, without crying. They rationed food tighter now, but no one starved. Late December, the town sent a messenger. Emery Dunn, the preacher's youngest boy, barely 10, stumbled up the ridge with a note sealed in wax. Abatha let him in, warmed his hands, gave him broth, then read it. The letter begged for aid, said the townspeople had pooled what was left, blankets, tools, even books, and asked if she might spare even a crate of dried apples. Just one. Abatha stared at the paper a long time. When she looked up, her eyes weren't soft. We can't feed the whole valley, she said to Tommy. But we can feed the fire, he replied. They both knew what that meant. That night, Abatha gathered the children and told them a story. She didn't tell them of death or frost or hunger. She told them of a tree she'd once seen, bent by wind so many times that it grew sideways, roots exposed, and still it lived. It gave shade. It sheltered birds, not because it was strong, but because it bent and kept its roots deep. You're that tree now, she told them. Clara leaned into her side. What about the others? Abatha didn't answer, but the next morning, Tommy took the sled and loaded it with 6 small pouches, each one sealed tight with wax, apples, root leather, dried trout. He sent Emery back down with them. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And then came the ice fog. By January, the cold deepened into a thing with teeth. A haze settled over the valley like breath frozen in place. Nothing moved. The creek stopped whispering. Even the trees cracked from the cold. And in the distance, something howled, but not a wolf, not a man, something in between. Tommy stood on the porch one morning, frost in his lashes, and whispered, "It's starting again." And Abatha, standing behind him, her face carved like flint, nodded once and said, "Then we hold." For 3 days the fog never lifted. It moved through the valley like a living thing, thick and pale and quiet. It dulled every sound and blurred every shape. Trees became phantoms. Paths vanished. You could hear your own breath louder than a scream. The cold crept into joints and soaked into bones like water into wool. Doors froze shut. Axes bounced off logs like dull hammers. The smoke from cabin chimneys curled straight down instead of up. People spoke in whispers, though no one knew why. Inside Abatha Crane's cabin, the fire never died. She'd built the hearth herself, stone by stone, after the first winter killed her boys. Not just a fireplace, but a heat trap, an oven of sorts with a flue system she designed from books and instinct, looping the smoke through brick passages before it left the chimney. It warmed the stones embedded into the wall. It made the cabin hold heat like a living creature. Each night, she boiled water and poured it into iron kettles, wrapping them in flannel to place near the beds. She fed the children a strict rotation of dried meat, root mash, and broth thickened with bean flour. No one went to bed hungry. No one had frostbite. They played. They argued. They sang once. Outside, people died with their boots on. It was Tommy who saw the boy first, a shape in the fog, stumbling toward their cabin like a scarecrow set loose. When Tommy rushed out, he thought it might be a dog. It wasn't. It was a child, barefoot, wrapped in burlap, frost on his eyelashes. The boy collapsed before he reached the steps. They dragged him in, stripped his rags, wrapped him in dry cloth. His feet were purple, his fingers swollen. Abatha forced hot broth into him, drop by drop, over hours. When he finally opened his mouth, he didn't cry. He just said, "They're all gone." "Who?" she asked gently. "My ma, my brothers. Cabin fell in." She looked to Tommy. No words, just a nod. Later, Tommy sledded down the ridge with a shovel and 3 empty sacks. He didn't bring them back full. Word began to spread. Even without letters, even without men moving between cabins, stories crawled like frost over windows. How the widow Crane's fire never dimmed, how her food never ran out, how she took in the lost. Some whispered she was part ghost herself, or worse. But most saw her now not as mad, but as prepared. And that, in the valley, was the closest thing to a god. The town's schoolhouse burned down in the fog. No one knows how. 2 children had been sleeping in it. The family that ran the store boarded themselves inside with a pig and a bolt-action rifle. 2 men froze while trying to reach the depot trail. Bodies found curled like dogs beneath a pine, eyes wide and white. In town, 1 in 5 was dead or dying. But on the ridge, inside Abatha's battered little cabin, 14 people were alive and warm. On the 4th day, the fog lifted, but only a little. The sun turned pale, like a smear of lard on tin. Visibility returned just enough for tracks to be seen, and those tracks were what made Tommy ready the traps again. Footprints circled the cabin. 4 men from the look of it. Heavy boots, spread out, not approaching directly but watching, waiting. They left no message, no mark, but they'd be back. Abatha stood in silence near the porch steps, rifle cradled in her arms. She didn't shiver. She didn't blink. Tommy stood beside her, holding a hatchet. "Want me to follow them?" he asked. "No," she said. "We let them make the first mistake." "Then what?" "Then we bury them with the others." The next evening, one of them returned, not with force, not with violence, but with a baby, wrapped in rags, cradled like a sack of flour. The man, narrow-eyed, teeth yellow, a scar like a nail scratched down his jaw, stood at the edge of the clearing and shouted. "Widow Crane," he called. "I ain't here to fight." Abatha opened the shutter but didn't come out. He held the baby higher. "This one's got no one left," he said. Her mama died, froze with her arms around her, just outside Branna's barn. He knelt. "I don't want no food, just somewhere warm for her." Tommy was already moving. They brought the baby in. The man left, true to his word. They never saw him again. That baby never cried, not once, but she lived. And as January turned into February, Abatha's stores began to shrink, not from rot, not from waste, but from simple numbers. The cabin now held 18 people. Every jar counted, every dried sliver of carrot, every fish bone saved for stock. So she started to teach. The children learned how to stretch broth with potato flour, how to shave slivers of beet into stew without bitterness, how to make dough from dried parsnips. She even taught them how to sun-dry in winter, using the porch, mirrors, stones heated all morning and stacked inside wooden boxes with glass lids. They began drying what scraps they could salvage. Even in the dead of cold, she made them prepare for next season. "We plan now," she said, "so we don't die later." And none of the children laughed. Not anymore. By March, the valley was broken. 32 dead, maybe more. A full third of the cabins collapsed under snow or fire. A man tried to eat a dog and died from the sickness that followed. The store was gutted in the night, only tracks left behind and the scent of blood. The ground began to thaw, just slightly, but the road was still impassable. No horses could be ridden, no wagons rolled. The outside world, if it still existed, was weeks away. And then someone shot a child. His name was Garrett, 9 years old. He'd left the cabin with Tommy to check traps. A figure behind a tree, a flash, a crack, a scream. He died before Tommy could carry him back. There was no food on him, no bait, nothing to steal, only the warmth in his coat. That night, Abatha didn't speak. She sat by the fire, her rifle in her lap, hands clenched. Clara came to her side and whispered, "What do we do?" Abatha answered like flint striking steel. "We wait, and we remember." The children buried Garrett in the thawed mud near her husband and boys, the first non-crane in that soil. They marked it with a cross of woven twigs and a jar of dried apples buried beside him. "So he never hungers," Clara said. And that was the turning point. The last of Abatha's stores now fit in 2 crates. She did the math each night, measured portions with the accuracy of a doctor carving away rot. She boiled bones twice, scraped jars until the glass shone, and still, she found a way. She taught them how to chew dried pine tips for vitamin, how to make tea from willow bark for pain. She taught them how to sit still, how to listen for wolves and men alike, how to mend shoes with bark, how to layer their sleeping spots with pine boughs beneath the quilts to reflect heat. Every night the fire burned, and every morning there were still 18 alive. Then, in April, came the sound no one had heard in nearly 4 months. A bell. Distant, clanging. It was the supply wagon, or what was left of it. 2 men on foot, dragging a sled of flour and dried goods, appeared at the far tree line, faces blackened with soot and cold, clothes shredded. One had a broken arm set with rope. The other was missing 2 toes. They didn't smile. They barely stood. But behind them came more wagons, dozens, like ants breaking into sunlight. The outside world had returned, and the first thing they asked was, who survived? And everyone said the same name, Abatha Crane. When they reached her cabin, they didn't knock. They bowed. They offered goods, money, blankets, apologies. She took none of it, only looked over the ridge to the half-buried cabins below, then back to the children clustered around her legs, all watching the wagons with wide, hollow eyes. "Tell them," she said, voice low. "We'll come down when the snow's melted." "What should we tell them you did?" one trader asked. She looked back into the cabin, at the shelves now mostly bare, at the fire still burning. at the shoes neatly lined by the door. "I remembered what winter took," she said, "and I didn't let it take anything else." They came by twos and threes, days after the thaw began, faces the widow had not seen since the first snow fell, men who once laughed at her sun racks and drying racks and tarps pinned with herbs, women who had whispered that she'd gone mad after her boys died, children now fatherless, or with fathers they could no longer recognize. Abatha didn't turn them away, but she didn't open the door either. They stood at the edge of her ridge, hat in hand, eyes cast down. One woman, June Melrose, who once told Abatha she was rotting herself into a ghost, came with a little girl and a bag of wool. "She's the last of mine," June said, voice like a rusted hinge. "I know what you did. I don't have food, but I have thread. I can sew. I'll do anything." Abatha didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a system. Hooks lined the walls for drying cloths and thawing kindling. One corner had been turned into a tiny larder, marked with chalked tally marks and rotating shelves. The children kept logs of everything eaten, even scraps were charted. Tommy had turned the back room into a tool station. He whittled handles, patched boots, rebuilt trap parts from scrap. He'd aged 5 years in the last 5 months. When the wagons finally brought flour and tins, he didn't touch them. He said simply, "We know how to make our own now." Abatha kept the fire going, always. She taught the children to bank it with ash at night and to stack wood by warmth level, green for smoke, dry for burn, pine for fast, oak for long. They used every part of everything. In late April, a letter arrived, carried by a young man from the depot, fresh-faced and dusted in road grime. He had no idea what had happened in the valley, just handed the letter to Tommy and said, "From the town council, they're gathering survivors." It wasn't a request. They were forming committees for rebuilding, for compensation, for organizing what they called provisions equity, a phrase that didn't sit right on anyone's tongue. The letter said they'd like Abatha Crane to come down and report her numbers. Tommy read it twice, then handed it to her. She read it once, then she fed it to the fire. That spring the trees leafed late. Ash Hollow Ridge still bore scars, collapsed sheds, animal bones, the half-collapsed grave markers of the early dead. But Abatha didn't look at those. She looked at the soil and began to plant. With hands scarred and stiff, she drew lines into the thawing earth and dropped seeds like memories into each one. Beans, peas, carrots, root vegetables first, hardier. The children helped. Clara took to digging like it was play. June helped build a frame for a drying wall. Taller than before, they'd learned, they'd endured, and now they planned, not for summer, but for the next winter. Abatha told them something her husband once said when ploughing a stubborn field. "You don't build a fire in the snow, you build it in the sun." They listened now. One day in May, Emery Dunn returned, the preacher's son. He wasn't a boy anymore, taller, face marked by frost scars. His mother had died midwinter. His father hadn't spoken since. He came not with a letter, but with a question. "They want to name the new square after you," he said, standing at the edge of her garden. "For what you did." Abatha kept digging. "You want to say anything?" She paused, then said, "Tell them to plant something useful there." He smiled. "Like what?" She stood, brushed dirt from her hands, and said, "Anything they can eat." That night, Tommy came in with a strange look on his face. He said there were visitors from beyond the pass, a man and woman, traveling with 2 horses and a pack mule, traders by the look of it. News from the outside, Colorado, Missouri, even back east. The man spoke of cities rebuilding, railways expanding. The woman said canned goods were coming cheaper, that the valley would soon see more than it could eat. She even offered to sell some tins now. Abatha only smiled. "We've got all we need," she said, then turned back to the hearth where 3 fish strips dried over willow smoke. They stayed the night, the travelers, ate stew with the children, listened to their stories. And in the morning, the woman asked a simple question. "How did you do it?" Abatha looked up, eyes still firelit even in daylight. "I watched the clouds," she said. "Ah, and I remembered." "Remembered what?" She paused, then said, "What it took from me before." The woman didn't understand, but Tommy did, and so did Clara, who spoke next. "We don't waste anything, not even pain." As spring deepened, the town below began rebuilding. New cabins, a proper store, a promise of telegraph repairs. Men now wore hats when they spoke to Abatha. Women brought baskets, and no one laughed anymore. Tommy was offered work as a guide. Clara was asked to help teach the other children. June started a small stitching house for orphaned girls, but none of them left the cabin, not yet. Abatha had started building something more than shelter. She'd built memory into the walls, a warning into every timber, and warmth into every stone. And even now, with sun on her porch and birdsong in the trees, she dried food carefully. Always. By early May, the trees below the ridge bloomed with tentative green, like hands unclenching after a long fist. Mud gave way to soft grass, and the melted snow unveiled what had been buried. The damage, the bones, the cabins crushed under the weight of storms. Wagons returned to the valley road, and for the first time in months, smoke curled from more than a few chimneys again. But Ash Hollow Ridge remained quiet, alive, but quiet. The widow's cabin hadn't changed much in structure. It was still the same single-story home with uneven shingles and windows patched with salvaged glass. But now it stood like a monument, not grand, not gilded, but unyielding. It had held, and the stories about it grew. They came to call it the Dry House at first. Just the children used the name, joking as they passed it on their way up the ridge. The dry house saved me. The dry house never runs cold. Only food goes in, only warmth comes out. But soon even the men of the valley used the name with quiet reverence. A trader passing through asked once, "Is it because she dried so much food?" And Clara, now sharper in speech than most women twice her age, had said, "No. It's because she dried her tears too." That silenced the man. The valley's leaders begged Abatha to join the spring council. She refused. They offered her a seat at the table to decide how stores were distributed next winter. She declined that too. "I already decided," she said. "I'll teach." And so she did. Children from the valley came in groups of 10, 3 days a week to learn. Not math, not reading, but survival. They learned how to build a smokehouse from creekstone and willow bark, how to bind herbs in bundles that wouldn't rot, how to salt trout in layers of birch ash, and line barrels with beeswax to seal moisture out. The first lesson she ever gave began with a simple question. "What's the most important tool you have?" They shouted answers. "Fire, knives, rope." Abatha shook her head. "Time," she said. They never forgot it. Tommy, now 18, had become something more than a boy, something steadier than just a helper. He stayed at her side, still called her Mom, even when others called her teacher, healer, or the crane of Ash Hollow. He built her a second shed, this one for curing hides and rendering fat. He brought up stone to reinforce the cabin's walls. He carved new gravestones for those buried behind the cabin, including Garrett's, which now bore a line of small animal tracks carved around its edges. His idea. One night, when the wind was warm for the first time in many months, he sat with her near the fire. "You think they'll remember all this?" he asked. Abatha stared into the flames. "No," she said, "not in the way we lived it." "Then why teach it?" "So, when winter comes again," she said, "they don't need to remember me, just what I did." The town tried to pay her, in coin, in gifts, in land. One man offered a horse, another a young milking cow. She turned them all down, except the cow, but only because the children begged her to keep it. They named her Larkspur. That spring, Larkspur gave milk to 17 mouths, and Abatha taught the children how to churn butter in a jar with nothing but 2 sticks and patience. In June, a new family arrived, new to the valley anyway. They'd lost their farm in the south to flood and followed the stories north. When they asked the townsfolk where they could settle, most people pointed up the ridge. "Talk to the widow," they said. "If she says yes, you're in." And that was how Abatha Crane became a gatekeeper, not by law, but by deed. The new family was young, quiet, a woman and her husband, both with hollow cheeks and soot-roughened hands, 2 small boys and a baby. They pitched a tent near the edge of the trees and waited. Abatha came down the ridge one morning with a jar of sun-dried tomatoes in one hand and a bone-handled knife in the other. She offered both. "If you know how to use the second," she said, "you'll earn the first." The woman nodded, and from that moment on, they were part of the ridge. By August, the ridge was a village, 3 cabins, 1 root cellar built into the earth with stones and packed straw, a communal smokehouse, 2 rows of raised beds for vegetables, a spring, rerouted with Tommy's help, now pooled in a man-made basin ringed by stones where children washed clothes and sometimes played, and the dry racks returned, taller, stronger, crafted from hardwood poles and scrap glass salvaged from the valley's burned buildings. Tomatoes, squash, herbs, fish, even mushrooms strung up like necklaces across the sun. They dried more that summer than even the year before. The townsfolk said it was unnecessary, but Abatha knew better. The first frost came early in September. No one panicked, because this time the valley was ready. And when the snow finally did arrive in late November, it found the people fed, warm, and quiet. No one begged, no one froze, no one died. That winter, Abatha took a single walk through town. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. Mothers nudged children to stand up straighter. Men tipped their hats and stepped aside. The storekeeper, Jed Huckley, who once joked she'd turned his place into a tannery, came out holding a jar of sugar and said, "On the house." She didn't take it, but she smiled. In January, they held a gathering, not a dance, not a sermon, just a meeting of every family that remained in the valley. Around the fire pit outside the new schoolhouse, they passed broth, tore flatbread, and read aloud a list of those who had died the year before. After each name, a child stepped forward and placed a rock into a large wooden bowl. Garrett's was the first. Tommy placed it himself. When the names were done, They passed the bowl to Abatha. She held it without speaking, then poured the rocks into the fire. The flames hissed, popped, and the whole valley stood silent. That night a child asked her, "What happens if the snow never comes back?" Abatha answered, "It always comes back, one way or another." "But what if it doesn't?" She looked toward the mountains. "Then we dry anyway." They never mocked her again, not for her tarps, not for her racks, not for the salt she bought or the jars she sealed, or the way she measured time, not in weeks or sermons, but in sunlight and dryness and silence. They didn't mock the widow for drying food, because they remembered the valley before and how it might have died if she hadn't.